Hello and welcome to the Eastern Front. I'm Yulia Zhoja with the Middle East Institute, Georgetown and George Washington Universities, and I'm joined, as always, by my colleague Dalibor Rohac, who is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Our special guest today will be Oleksandr Kraiev, who is the director of the North America program at the Ukrainian think tank PRISM. On that a little bit later. In the meantime, on our podcast, we discuss security, politics, and culture of Eastern Europe and their continued relevance to the United States. If you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Let us start with our first segment, the news from the Eastern Front. We have two past news and one coming up, and that is the BRICS summit in Kazan, Russia, the Moldova elections and referendum results, and then looking briefly into what we should expect in the coming days with the elections in Georgia. But we want to start off with the BRICS summit, where we basically have the trio of evil resistance or whatever, of chaos or whatever you want to call it, meeting up in Kazan. Russia, we have China, we have now Iran, I think, co-joining, and we have the UN Secretary General Gutierrez, who's also joining, which is a crazy instance because he has also at the same time refused to join the Ukraine Peace Summit that is being planned. We're not doing a podcast on the United Nations. There's so much to say right now about what is going on there, but we want to briefly focus on the BRICS with, I guess, the overarching title that Dalibor suggested a minute ago when we were discussing, which is we haven't isolated Russia enough. Dalibor, is that your takeaway from what is happening?
We haven't isolated Russia enough, and I think we are doing an increasingly worse job at isolating Russia. I mean, this trip by the UN Secretary General, I don't think would have been thinkable in the first year of the war. I mean, it still came as a bit of a shock to me, notwithstanding everything we know about the UN system and Gutierrez, and I think it sort of leaves a stain on the UN's moral reputation. But more importantly, it sort of shows that the United States and its allies are really not on top of our game when it comes to this. I mean, Gutierrez is a Portuguese politician. We have levers over Portugal. We should have levers over other countries that are assembling in Kazan at the BRICS summit. There are sticks and carrots we sort of choose not to use. I think part of it has to do with campaign season being in full swing in the United States, the EU being distracted with new commission coming in and hearings and all the rest of it. But it's just, the world is not going to wait for us to get our act together. And I think there is a kind of like a secular trend that makes everything kind of harder and harder as time goes on. I think there is a real sort of demand in many capitals for just this Ukraine issue to go away and for everybody sort of to get over it and get back to maybe not complete business as usual, but just like not to have it on the plate every day. And I think that really bodes ill for the outcome of this war, because it suggests that this war will not be resolved in a way that would bring durable peace, but will be kind of put on the back burner, ready to be re-inflamed at some later point. So I think this is a very bad piece of news. Not to speak about the optics of having Gutierrez in Russia on the same day that North Korean generals and army officers are taking selfies on the Red Square as they are ready to engage in what is a genocidal war against Ukraine.
Yeah, we are seeing the widening of the war and not rain on the Europeans. You've done a good job on that, and I think we shouldn't let them go away easily. But it's also spectacular to me, this administration, how it has normalized just looking at things and observing and pointing to it like there's nothing to be done, and even a discussion about what should be done or how we should respond to BRICS, for instance, is off the table. We're seeing this happening, but we're not discussing what should be done or if something should be done about this. The administration is not, and neither do the Europeans. And it's in the same way with North Korea. North Korea Korea, an adversary of the United States, and I would argue of the European Union too, is sending troops to the European continent to fight, as you said, in a genocidal war. And Lloyd Austin, defense secretary, says if Ukraine collapses, if Ukraine falls apart, then Europe collapses too. And he keeps warning us and others of the administration too that the North Koreans are closer, they're in Russia now, tomorrow they'll be in Ukraine. But it seems we've gotten so normalized into this administration that we're not even questioning the fact that all they do is inform us. They inform us that Russia is going to invade Ukraine. They inform us that Iran is contributing to this war. Now they're informing us that North Korea is contributing with troops, and that's it. Neither the EU nor the United States, nor NATO for that matter, shouldn't this be a NATO issue? It's at the borders to NATO, are discussing the meaning and the measures that we should be taking against North Korea and the, whatever you want to call it, axis of chaos, resistance, evil, whatever you want to call it. So it seems like anything that is happening now on the front in Ukraine or beyond is just going to be, we're going to be informed. If Russia is escalating, we're going to be informed.
I suppose that's, in some ways revealing this intelligence was useful in the run-up to the full-scale invasion, and probably the lesson taken by the administration is that, this is what they're going to do at every occasion as a substitute for action. And clearly I understand that 2 weeks before the US election, you don't want to sort of slap coercive measures against, say China, because it's taking part in a BRICS summit, but surely we have some levers over South Africa, over Brazil, over India. Surely they want to trade, surely they want US military equipment, surely they want to, do something with us. And it looks like we are totally sort of foregoing the use of those levers.
In one small more bit to add to stay sort of connected to the Eastern Front is this year Turkey and Azerbaijan have made bids to join BRICS. Turkey is a NATO member. All we have learned is that Turkey does that, and we have been informed again. There's no measures, there's no discussion about it. And with Azerbaijan too, smaller than India, smaller than Brazil, of course we have levers. The EU is buying a significant part of their product, which is oil and gas. And so there's significant things that we could do, but it's not that we don't have the instruments, it's also that we're just not in the mode of asking what should be done about it. It's state of affairs, it seems. That then enables me to turn to another state of affairs, a problematic one, which is the Moldova referendum. So we had on the past Sunday, elections, first round of presidential elections in Moldova, in which Maia Sandu, the current president, pro-Western president that we all know and mention on the podcast, has been running for a second term. And at the same time, she has put forth a referendum for Moldovans to vote whether they want to join the European Union. And of course, it was not a great idea to do that because on the one hand, Moldova is well on the path of integration, so it's not a matter of asking the EU. But on the other hand, Moldova has been deeply influenced over the years by Russia, and Russia has now mobilized all of its instruments. And so the result is bad but good, but better than it could be, I guess. The result is a razor sharp difference with very thin margin voting in favor of Moldova's EU accession. The president, Maia Sandu, has in the meantime gone out to say that, unsurprisingly, Russia has been organizing an unprecedented influence operation and has been buying 300,000 votes. The difference in votes between yes and no was a few thousand, not hundreds of thousands. But nevertheless, this razor-sharp result is disabling her European mandate. She will most likely win in the second round, though it's a bit harder. But what does it say on the European Union's relationship with Moldova, the fact that there's only a thin majority that want to join the European Union, when in the big picture, it's obvious. Young or old people, do you want to live like in Berlin or do you want to live like in Moscow? It's not a difficult question, but of course we know it's more complicated than that. And just to add a few more numbers to show us where we're at with our measures pushing back against Russia and preventing this from happening, because we kind of knew it was happening. We exactly knew that Russia is influencing, is that the National Security Advisor of Maya Sandu has approximated that this year Russia will have invested about $100 million, euros, I forget, into influence operations and disinformation. That's an unprecedented sum for Moldova, the poorest country in Europe. But on the other hand, yes, the EU has the money. A few days before the elections, the President Commission Ursula von der Leyen went to the capital, to Chisinau, to promise 1 billion euros in aid in the next few years for Moldova. But for the random voter, this is too little too late. Ursula von der Leyen can promise all she wants, but they know that they get in their hand a bribe from Russia worth hundreds or thousands of dollars, and they haven't gotten much from the European Union at all. So it was to be prevented, it was to be influenced to have a better result by enabling more of the European Union earlier, better. But of course, we've failed at that. The European Union has been busy with the summer vacation and God knows what else. And so now we have this a bit of a mess that significantly weakens Moldova's political path.
I am more disappointed than kind of, encouraged by the results of the Moldovan referendum and the first round of the presidential election. The margin should not have been this narrow. We agree it was always a bad idea to put this to a referendum. I don't think the referendum buys anything to the pro-European forces in Moldova. What matters is whether Moldova makes progress in accession talks, whether it closes chapters, whether it implements reforms, and having something written up in the constitution just doesn't do anything to accelerate progress along that path. It just created this vulnerability. We see how Russia exploited it. In September alone, Moldovan authorities sort of identified $15 million going to bank accounts of 130,000 Moldovan citizens in a sort of effort to buy votes. And you have to wonder, what is being done to sort of prevent Russia from doing this again in other contexts? What kind of deterrence through punishment the EU or the US or anybody else is implementing? And I don't see any answer to that question. So obviously in Georgia you don't really have sort of crude vote buying going on, but you have some, I don't know, but there is a wider array of sort of mechanisms and tricks and shenanigans that the Russians are trying to pull off, and I'm dreading the results coming in from Georgia this weekend.
What are you expecting? We already have protests on the street in the last couple of days, but Dalibor, you've had a recent event on Georgia too with AI. What are you expecting in terms of both results as well as turmoil?
So at this event, I think the emerging consensus was that the opposition should be on track towards winning the election jointly. I mean, that they should be able to sort of form a new cabinet. But again, we had the same expectation with regard to Moldova's referendum, right? No, I don't think anybody predicted that it would come down to 12,000 votes. And then the question will be in Georgia how Georgian Dream will react to that. So if we have kind of indications from exit polls from some districts that it is indeed going in the opposition's direction, we'll have to sort of wait and see what sort of tricks Georgian Dream will try to pull off, whether it's just sort of faking the results, stuffing ballot boxes. Our guest at this event we did at AEI yesterday talked about the sort of many different schemes in which kind of one vote for Georgian Dream can be multiplied by 10 through some sort of complicated kind of ballot stuffing scheme. So if there is stuff like that going on and then Georgians take it to the streets, we'll be back in kind of Rose Revolution, Maidan Revolution of Dignity scenario in which it will be the regime against the street. And moreover in the country where there is already a strong Russian presence, both sort of infiltration by security services, but also Russian tanks on the ground. And yes, Russia might be distracted, but I think there is still potential for them to do a lot of harm and potentially in a irreparable way.
With this bleak perspective onto the Georgian elections, we're turning to our next segment with Oleksandr Kraiev. Oleksandr Kraiev is the director of the North America program at the Ukrainian think tank PRISM that I'm a fan of. I've worked with others before of your colleagues. So, Oleksandr, it's great to have you with us. Obviously, we will be talking about North America in Ukraine, and we want to ask you about how Trump's position is perceived in Ukraine, what people expect from Harris if she becomes president. But before we get into the details of that, let me just ask you broadly how the elections, the other way around, we keep looking at the US perspective on Ukraine here from Washington, D.C., but how are the US elections seen in Ukraine? How important are they? How much do people realize or frame, I guess, the issue of the outcome of the elections as being existential in a way for Ukraine and for the outcome of this war?
Basically speaking, the general understanding is quite practical. That the United States is our most generous and most reliable ally, no matter what. And we do understand the necessity for, let's call it, a decisive leadership in our allied sphere, especially with our main ally. And that is why, of course, a lot of Ukrainians, even the common population of Ukraine, is concerned with the elections, with its result. Of course, I do not suggest that all the Ukrainians are very into the intricacies and delicacies of internal policies of the United States, but generally speaking, all of them are quite interested in this topic. And if we speak about the media coverage, well, from my own research, nearly 25% of all Ukrainian media coverage, to some extent, is about American elections and the potential influence of every given candidate on our bilateral relations, and more importantly, on the war itself. However, apart from that, a lot is spoken not about the election per se, but about the lame duck period of Joseph Biden. So it's not only about who will be the next president, but what the last several months of the current presidency will look like. Because these are questions, quite frankly, related to rockets, related to all the necessary documents concerning the use of high-range rockets onto the territory of Russia, and of course it is about NATO. It is about starting the negotiations, starting the process, and all the other talks around it. So basically, as I stated at the beginning, it's not about ideology. It's not only about good feelings towards our American counterparts and our American friends. It's mostly about a very practical approach, what will help Ukraine to survive not only this winter, but to survive the Russian assault. And it's not only about the next president, as I have already stated, it is about the current one and the last months of his active duty.
So clearly there is this sort of short-term question with the next supplemental and restrictions on the use of US weapons. However, it strikes me that the much bigger challenge for Ukraine is really navigating what seems to be the prospect of a new Trump administration. So I'm not sure when this episode comes out, but since October 8th, on prediction markets, Donald Trump has had a lead over Vice President Harris. So he's now trading at around 59 cents. So that suggests to me that people have to think seriously about, what that administration will look like and what its Europe policies will look like. And I think European allies have to think about it really hard, from the French to the Poles and Ukrainians as well. If there is one thread going through Republican foreign policy thinking, which is becoming increasingly assertive, is the notion that China is the dominant challenge for the United States. Also, that resources are not unlimited and the United States has to be kind of ruthless in prioritizing and focusing on what really matters. And there is a sense of nervousness or trepidation among advocates of Ukraine on how Ukraine sort of fits into that view of the world. So if you were to make the case to, say, the next Republican-nominated National Security Advisor or Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense, or to Donald Trump himself, how would you sort of make it clear to them that Ukraine really matters and that abandoning Ukraine in this existential struggle is no way of advancing America's interest in its long-term geopolitical competition with China?
I suggest I should start with the notion from Ukrainian side, because unfortunately, I do see this, I should call it preposterous decisiveness of Ukrainian authorities that Trump will be all right for Ukraine. Here in Ukrainian prism and in the expert community of Ukraine, we do understand that is not all right. Such unpredictability, such lack of constructive, let's say, strategic approach, more generally speaking, is not okay for a country in war. But at the same time, from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to Office of President of Ukraine, we hear the same banter that we dealt with Trump previously, we'll know what do with Trump nowadays. Well, of course, they do forget about the Ivanovich scandal, they do forget about the recut scandal and all the recordings that Ukrainian government provided or not provided to Trump and Biden. So basically, unfortunately, we do see the lack of political memory on the side of Ukrainian decision makers. But answering to a question about what specific arguments are to be made to the future Secretary of State or National Security Advisor or whoever it is in Trump administration who will deal with Ukraine, maybe even Kushner, I don't know, because Kushner deals basically with everything in Trump administration where Trump doesn't want to show his face. There are two main arguments that we see here. First and foremost, Ukraine is a great photo opportunity. Ukraine is a great image building opportunity for Trump. Because during his first term at presidency, we did see this pattern repeating itself. Trump was using foreign relations, especially during visits, especially during big conferences, especially on the backdrop of the major conflicts. He was using it to show himself off. He was using it to build his image of a quasi-democratic strongman, somebody who can deal with difficult situations, who can get the countries and alliances out of crisis, who can deal with everything just by taking the phone and making some calls, who can be a decisive leader. Well, the same strategy he used in his business talks, all in all, but the same goes for foreign relations. For him, it was a very good image building activity. And the second, more practical point is, of course, about benefits. It is about money. We did hear in our communication with executives from the military-industrial complex of the United States that rearming Ukrainian army nowadays, and especially resupplying and rearming Ukrainian army after the ceasefire agreement is brokered, one way or another, will be a contract of century for the American military and industrial complex. We are not talking about hundreds of billions, they said. We are talking about trillions of dollars in the perspective of 10 to 20 years. And basically, Ukraine will have to have a standing army of more than 1 million servicemen. Ukraine will have more defense agreements with our neighbors and everything. We'll have to have more of modern supplied weapons. And so it's all about the future investments. It's all about American capital and American industry being able and ready to be present here and to help Ukraine rebuild. Because just to be once again on the practical side of issues, for example, the tank factory that was near Zhytomyr is 95% destroyed. Nearly 89% of all the capabilities of Ukraine industry that was producing ammunition, even the most, banal infantry ammunition, it is also either destroyed or badly damaged. So it's all about future investment, future coming into Ukrainian market, and that's something that Trump will definitely like, with all his business talk approach to foreign policy, with all this profit-making foreign policy and everything. We do believe that these two approaches, image-making and profit-making, will work with Trump one way or another.
We want to ask you about Harris too, because it is important. But I have one more set, I guess, of questions on Trump. One thing to state and two questions to ask you, and it's related to what you just said. So a few weeks ago, when Trump did not look as good in the polls, I was discussing with some colleagues and friends what it would mean for Ukraine, that we're working on Ukraine in the government, what it would mean for Ukraine for Trump to come back. And someone who's very close to the Republicans told me, but working on Ukraine, told me the one thing that Ukrainians and us supporting Ukraine have to do is to make him look good if he wins, right? I don't know, rename Crimea the Trump Peninsula, do something like that. So I'm just putting it out there, right? But then jokes aside, and this is the semi-joke, right? Two questions, and this is based on Ukraine's efforts for survival and what Trump is putting forth, or the people around around him. What we know, other than he's going to make peace in the first 2 months before he even becomes president or re-becomes president, and we have no idea how that's going to be, is the article, the op-ed that we saw in The Hill a few weeks ago, signed by Robert F. Kennedy, who has endorsed him, and J.D. Vance, his running mate as vice president, who are saying that Ukraine should, at the end of this negotiation, whatever it would look like, that Ukraine should be neutral. This is counter to the peace plan from Ukraine and something counter also to what we think is vital. Dalibor calls it really well, the 1-point peace plan that we need, which is Ukraine either in NATO or security guarantees, bilateral ones. So what do we do with that? If Trump comes to power and enforces, can he enforce neutrality on Ukraine? And what does that look like? And because I think that's related also to arms sales, right? After the fact. And then the second thing is reparations. This is crazy what they're putting forth, but what they're putting forth is that Ukraine pay for its own reparations. So then the issue of rebuilding nuclear power plants or rearming big time is out of the question, right? This is not something that Ukraine will be able to afford. So what is Ukraine's plan, if there is any, or do you have any ideas that you can give your administration on how to address the reparations issue as well as the neutrality issue?
Yeah, well, speaking about neutrality, first of all, it's not said and done that Trump will basically push on neutrality. Of course, it's a grave concern for us, and of course, we're working on it. To cut a long story short, the main objective for Ukrainian foreign policy, in case Trump or whoever else there will push for neutrality and will not support Ukrainian peace formula or victory plan. The main objective for us is to get as much European assistance and as much European support as possible, because although European nuclear powers are much less powerful than the United States, and of course they are not a match for Russian nuclear power, but at the same time they still have some weight, especially if we speak about NATO. They still have some weight if we speak about these bilateral security treaties, these future bilateral guarantees, because although President Zelensky said that we already have bilateral guarantees, well, it's a wordplay. There are no guarantees, there are assurances on the mutual support, etc., etc. So they're not guarantees, but the main objective is to create the situation where the United States will be the only one pushing for neutrality, and then the logic of the so-called collective West and the general international arena where the United States should provide for some assertive position, even in the eyes of China, because of course when we're speaking about US helping Ukraine and everything, we should also speak about China, because if Ukraine fails, well, then China has a lot more confidence in doing something with Taiwan, with South China Sea, with Vietnam, with the Philippines. So basically the idea for us is a twofold. On one side, we should get all the support from the Europeans that we can in order to convince the United States and future administration to support us as well. And the second one is to provide, let's call it, a more geopolitical look on a situation that failing in Ukraine will also provide for more failures in future. Well, the domino effect, the same one, but not on the scale of one particular region, but on the scale of a grandeur scheme of, how did Biden call it, dictatorship fighting against democracies in Ukraine, on Taiwan, and also in Israel. So basically, our job as Ukrainian experts and Ukrainian diplomats is to paint a bigger picture, to provide for not small resolutions to small issues, but to make these things global and to push for a notion that Ukraine is a systemic issue. It's not an issue of, as Trump said, some other country 5,000 miles away. It's an issue of international system working properly and working for American profit. You see, I'm already spoken the Trump language on profit, profit, profit. So that's the main issue with this neutrality thing and everything. And the second question was reparations. Well, reparations is kind of in a kinky situation as of now, because currently, unfortunately, I am not in a position to disclose all the issues that we are talking about with our stakeholders concerning the possible peace negotiations. But publicly, we do say that there are three, as we call it, flexible points that can be discussed with Russians. First, it's territory, but we do say that no Russia, neither Ukraine are ready to discuss territory, so it definitely will be put out of brackets. as it was with Crimea since 2014. Second topic is neutrality, once again, and there are many sub-layers to this issue. For example, it's about European Union, it's about NATO, it's about bilateral treatments and everything, but also the situation is quite dire there, and not Russians, not we are ready to go on some kind of compliances there. And the third basket of issues, which is the most flexible one and the most, let's say, promising in case of negotiations, is about reparations, is about Russian money being held in the West, and it is about sanctions. So basically, the idea is that if we are not able to push Russians on territories, they will not accept anything. If we do see that Russia can put a blind eye, for example, on some starting of NATO negotiations or some kind of invitation to NATO or something like that, then we will be forced to make concessions concerning Russian funds that were planned for Ukraine reconstruction. So basically the idea is that more than 65% of Russian funds are in the Western Hemisphere, they're being in international funds, international banks, and basically getting these funds back to Russia and not using it for the reconstruction may be a point of a compromise for Ukraine in order for Russia to adhere to some kind of a blind eye on NATO negotiations of Ukraine and the Western powers. So it's still a work in progress. It's still only one minor suggestion, but for the last month and a half, me and my colleagues, we do see more and more talks about using frozen Russian assets and using some kind of a deliberate sanction lifting as a tool to negotiate on NATO and possible step back from neutrality of Ukraine if we speak about direct negotiations with Russia. So basically, it's a twofold issue. If we make compromise on NATO and Ukraine is able to start NATO negotiation, then the issue of reconstruction is gone. But if we are pushing hard on reconstruction and using Russian money to rebuild Ukraine and rebuild Ukrainian army, then we are not sure then we will be able then to start NATO negotiation without any major escalation on the Russian side.
This is very interesting, isn't it? Because I don't happy talk the prospect of a possible Trump administration, but when you think about Ukraine's reconstruction, I think the one thing that is not very likely is to have US taxpayers pay for it. At the same time, many Western European countries are essentially broke, faced with massive debt burdens. So for all the frustration that we've already had with these debates about what to do with frozen sovereign Russian assets, it seems more likely than not that sooner or later those will be used to provide some form of financing to Ukraine in the future. So we might not want to lose hope on that front.
Can I ask a quick Kamala question? We didn't get around to it, and there's still a chance that Kamala Harris will win the presidency. Her position on Ukraine, we expect, we're speculating, would not be too far away from Biden, couldn't be too far away from Obama, maybe. So that's kind of the spectrum that we're looking at. What's your take on this?
Well, here in Ukraine, that's the main concern for us, that we will have Biden 202. Well, basically, Biden was not bad for Ukraine. Let's not be very pessimistic on that. But Biden was not great as well. So basically, we do see that a lot of support's coming in for Ukraine to survive, but not as much for Ukraine to prosper and win. So basically, it's not about the support itself, it's about the approach, it's about the strategy. Is it boiling the frog alive for a long time, or it's helping us to withstand Russian aggression right here and right now? But let's say the main burden in this regard, but also the main point of opportunity for us, as it is said in Ministry of Foreign Affairs and other stakeholders, is that Kamala lacks herself as a politician. She lacks foreign policy expertise, and that is why she will rely totally on her State Department, on her Secretariat of Defense, and on her foreign policy advisor. And basically, if we speak about our cooperation between ministers of defense, if we speak about the cooperation at the level of MFA, we do see a lot of prospects there. We do understand that, as we call it, professional level of diplomacy works really fine for Ukraine. And most of the so-called hawks in the Democratic Party, they're already taken their position in the Department of Defense and the State Department. So basically, Kamala is a risky one. Not as risky as Trump, definitely. But we do see an opportunity to make things work. If we work on the level of professional diplomacy, not only the political slogans. Because as of now, we do understand this period in American elections, we do understand it from Ukrainian point of view. It is about slogans. It is about winning attention, winning voters. We get it. It's okay. But after that, we do rely on some kind of professional diplomacy and military diplomacy as well.
So recently, President Zelensky floated this idea of a Ukrainian nuclear deterrent as a possible alternative to the country's NATO membership, which reminds one of a very old article in 1993, and I'll let you guess the author, in Foreign Affairs, where this arch-realist makes a very similar proposition. I'm going to just quote a couple of sentences from that piece before I ask you my question. A nuclear Ukraine makes sense for two reasons. First, it is imperative to maintain peace between Russia and Ukraine. That means ensuring that the Russians, who have a history of bad relations with Ukraine, do not move to reconquer it. Ukraine cannot defend itself against a nuclear-armed Russia with conventional weapons, and no state, including the United States, is going to extend to it a meaningful security guarantee. Ukrainian nuclear weapons are the only reliable deterrent to Russian aggression. If the US aim is to enhance stability in Europe, the case against a nuclear-armed Ukraine is unpersuasive. So, A, who wrote that?
Unfortunately, I have several names on my mind who could have written that, but currently I'm quite sure that the current speechwriter for Zelensky have already used this article for his latest appearances, because the arguments are all just the same.
It was very much not a friend of the podcast, John Mearsheimer, in 1993. And B, and more importantly, is this something that is in the cards, assuming that Ukraine doesn't really get an invitation to join NATO post this war? Because the range of options for really deterring Russians on a permanent basis, is not massively wide. There isn't a whole lot that you can do. And this is one of the things.
That's definitely true, but going with the logic of Zelensky administration, if we are saying it publicly, we are not meaning it. Let's call it that way. Because all the other quasi-nuclear powers or rogue nuclear powers was not very vocal on their aspirations before they created the first bomb. They were not very vocal on providing the information on their capabilities and everything. And the same goes for Ukraine. Everything that we want to be done, we done silently, and then we present it as a fact. And speaking about this particular piece of Zelensky's strategy, that's the same kind of provocations that he used, for example, in 2018, when he said that, well, probably the European Union and NATO are not the only passes for Ukraine, because he started his presidency with being quite a Euro and NATO skeptic. And he stated that he will be able to see peace in the eyes of Putin. We just need to stop shooting and everything. So basically that's the same kind of deal with the nuclear weapons. So he likes to provoke both his opponents and his friends in order to see what they are ready to do in order to stop such an escalative scenario. That's the first issue, political one, and very shortly, the economic one. Unfortunately, Ukraine is economically not in a position to create its own nuclear weapon. We have the capabilities, technically speaking, but economically speaking, it's not the projects that we can take right here and right now. And of course, we do understand that the moment that Russians have some kind of intelligence on it, and unfortunately, there are still a lot of Russian eyes and ears here in Ukraine, even here in Kiev. We do understand that the Russian retaliation and preemptive strike, as they call it, will just be massive. The biggest strike since the beginning of war. So it's not a risk worth taking.
All right, that's an interesting note to finish on. Oleksandr Kraiev, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And now we're turning to our third segment, our recommendations list, when we have things that are relevant to the Eastern Front. And this time it's Dalibor. What's your recommendation?
I have a paper for our listeners, a report written by a group of authors at the Center for Defense Reforms, which is a Kiev-based think tank, which looks at the connections between Russia, Russian security forces, intelligence, RT, and the sort of whole ecosystem around people like Dugin and Vladimir Yakunin and Ruski Mir Foundation, these sort of like influence operations on the one hand, and retired generals, officers, and just sort of national security professionals in NATO countries. So there is money being channeled, there are conferences being held, there is, sort of uncanny interest that Russia has in cultivating realist in quotation marks, thought in Europe, in countries such as France, which is the home to the French Center for Realist Geopolitics, ran by two retired French army officers with obvious personal, maybe financial connections to Russia. So it's a report that kind of maps this landscape and makes for a very, very disturbing read, especially given that stuff like this should not be happening 2 years into the full-scale invasion. I thought much of Western Europe was beyond these kind of obvious vulnerabilities that people were sort of talking about a decade ago. But it's still there, and it still shapes the public debate.
Very interesting. So check out the report if you want to find the pro-Russian intellectuals in the still existing and, I guess, proliferating their ideas in the Western world. Thank you for listening to The Eastern Front, a podcast on the security, politics, and culture of Eastern Europe and their continued relevance to the United States. You can find more episodes and additional content on our website, aei.org, where you can also subscribe to receive our newsletter. We're on Twitter, LinkedIn, and other social media platforms. Don't be a stranger, and send us your tips for future guests and topics you'd like us to discuss. If you enjoy this episode, consider subscribing, reviewing, and rating us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you, and until next time, bye.